So is there anything that can't be doubted? Is there any indubitable belief? And Descartes argues, yes, there is. And it's this belief. I am, just that I currently exist. Descartes says, whenever I have this thought, it must be true. So this is interesting. Even if you're in the matrix, even if you're just a brain in a mad scientist lab, still, if you think I exist, that must be true. It's not coherent to suppose that it's false. And even the greatest deceiver there could not deceive you about this. If you're having this thought, I am, you do exist, Descartes says. In his earlier work called Discourse on Method, he puts it this way: I think, therefore I am. And in Latin, that's cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Sometimes you'll see this point about I am called Descartes' cogito, and he puts it in this way in this earlier book, and it can sort of give you the idea that he has an argument in mind. So the argument would go like this: premise one is I think, premise two is I think only if I exist, and the conclusion is therefore I exist. So this therefore makes you think that it's an argument. However, Descartes tells us that it's not an argument. He says, I think, therefore I am, but his point is really better put by saying, whenever I have this thought that I am, that I exist, it must be true. So he's not giving this argument. Look, this is a strange argument. You might think it's circular, because the first premise presupposes that I exist, right? And whoops, that's the conclusion. So it's not the most crass kind of circular argument where the whole conclusion is actually a premise, but it has a premise that seems to presuppose a conclusion. Premise that if you believed it, you would also believe the conclusion. So anyway, he's not giving a circular argument for the conclusion that he exists. He is just basically observing that he exists, and he says this is a belief about which you cannot possibly be deceived. So it is indubitable. It's undoubtable. Okay, well, then it looks like there's something that you can know. So global skepticism is false. If Descartes is right that people can know that they presently exist, then it's false that no one ever knows anything, because I know that I am. But remember, if you refute global skepticism by showing that we just know one thing or a very few number of things, you still leave a lot of skepticism unrefuted. So you might wonder, how do we also now refute skepticism about the external world? If I can know that I exist, what else can I know? Well, you might think you could know that you feel a certain way, or you can know how things seem to you right now. But could you know that you're in class, or that you've been on a date last night, or that you have shoes on your feet? Can you know any of those things? So Descartes has an anti-skeptical purpose. He wants to show that human beings really do have knowledge. They have a lot of knowledge. They know roughly what you would think they know when you start. But how is he going to get there? How is he going to rebuild the rest of the building of human knowledge? So he's torn the building down to the foundations. He's found an unmovable foundation, which is the proposition or the belief, I exist. Okay, but how are you now going to turn out to know that 1 plus 1 is 2, that you had a hamburger for lunch yesterday, or that you're holding up a hand in front of your face right now. How are you going to know things like that? Looks like you could still be deceived about all those things. Well, I just want to finish by giving you an outline of what I call Descartes' restorative strategy. So this is what he does in the rest of the book, Meditations on First Philosophy. And we're not going to read the rest of the book. We're just sticking with these first couple of chapters on epistemology. Um, so the part we've looked at is this. And these are kind of 4 stages to his project, um, rather than a rigorous formulation of an argument. So we've just seen why he thinks he's shown that human beings know this, right? And he thinks that we can also know that a perfect being exists. So briefly, he gives what philosophers call an ontological argument. And we'll actually look at this later in the course. And when you first hear this argument, it sounds like a trick, but it is a serious argument that many hundreds of papers have been written on, and even some books. And the argument goes, the idea of God is the idea of a perfect being, and one perfection is existing. So if a perfect being has all perfections and one perfection is existing, then God must exist. There's a contradiction in supposing there's a perfect being which doesn't exist, because if it lacked existence, it wouldn't be perfect. Now this argument has a lot of problems, but basically Descartes thinks that we can demonstrate that God exists. Because God exists and is perfect, it follows, he would say, that my most sure-seeming beliefs must all be true. Now God can let us make mistakes. He can allow us to be sloppy and ignore evidence and make hasty judgments and so on. But when it comes to those basic intuitions, those maximal feelings of certainty, he'd be a deceiver if he built us so that we could have those about false beliefs. So we would have to be built such that when we had those experiences, it was only about a true belief. Okay, maybe. Yeah, it seems wrong to deceive us in that massive way. So if there's a perfect being, he'd be morally perfect and he wouldn't do that. Descartes thinks also that we can infer that all our belief-forming faculties are reliable, not necessarily perfect, but at least generally reliable when rightly used. So that's his basic strategy. And most philosophers, though, have a hard time um, seeing how he gets from 1 to 2. I mean, if he's going to give some argument that God exists, it looks like he already has to be able to trust how things seem to him. Right? He has an intuition that it's impossible that there be a non-existing perfect being. But yeah, why can you trust when things seem impossible to you? So a lot of us think that there's a pretty desperate problem with getting from 1 to 2, and that it can't be done. Philosophers call this the Cartesian circle. It goes like this: we know that our faculties, that is our belief-forming faculties, are trustworthy only if we know that God exists. You need God to guarantee the reliability of those belief-forming abilities that you have. But the problem is we know that God exists only if we know that our faculties are trustworthy. So to know one, you have to know the other already, and so it seems that you can't know either. So philosophers call this the Cartesian circle. And they have, and some philosophers like Ernest Sosa have written very sophisticated pieces in which they defend Descartes against this objection. They say, well, he's really got 2 kinds of knowledge, and you first have the lower kind of knowledge, that God exists, and then that gives you that leads to your having the higher kind of knowledge that God exists. And so there's a way to try to get around this circularity. You can know things in one sense, but not another sense. But I won't go into that here. That gets pretty complicated. And if you find this interesting, you should definitely take an upper level course in epistemology sometime. Okay, but maybe Descartes doesn't have a good answer, or maybe he does. As I mentioned, a lot of philosophers don't buy Descartes' own solution in Meditations on First Philosophy. Of course, the question is, what do you say? You don't want to agree with global skepticism, right? Hasn't Descartes showed that that's false? Don't you right now know that you exist? But look, isn't it also reasonable to trust at least vivid and clear memories? Like, don't you remember that I had certain pictures in the first segment of this lecture? Don't you remember that I had a picture of a guy, an old guy with a hat on, in a previous segment? And don't you know that the lights are on in the room right now? Don't you know that you have a pen in your hand? But how can you know these things? It looks like you have to agree that it's possible that you're mistaken, that you can't be 100% certain that uh, this isn't all a trick. Yet on the other hand, it seems that there's no reason to believe that you're subject to massive deception. So this debate in epistemology is ongoing. It's a big subfield in philosophy. Philosophers are still arguing about what exactly it takes to know something. Most of the discussion is around what it takes to have adequate evidence or justification for your belief. And I'm not a skeptic myself. I think we have to be careful in what we claim we know, but I think there is a lot that human beings know. So next time we'll look at a philosopher who uh, tries to give a more general response, a different kind of response and a simpler response than Descartes gives. And he specifically targets external world skepticism and not just global skepticism.